Welcome everyone to this Morgan Hunt Celebrating Different Perspectives webinar. This is the first in our four-part diversity and inclusion series, and this morning we will explore the benefits of an inclusive and diverse workforce, as well as the current challenges organisations may face building an inclusive culture. My name is Clare Keniry, and I am the director at Morgan Hunt responsible for the technology recruitment business, and I also take a lead on diversity and inclusion at Morgan Hunt. As recruiters, we are keenly aware of our critical role in attracting diverse talent and practicing inclusive selection, and we work hard to support our customers to build inclusive cultures. So I'm really delighted this morning to introduce you to our expert panel. Firstly, to Carmen Morris. Carmen is the MD of Keniry Consulting, which is an award-winning diversity and inclusion consultancy. She has been working in the diversity and inclusion field for over 25 years, and Carmen is a regular expert contributor to Forbes.com on the issues of race, diversity, and leadership. She is currently providing consultancy services to a range of global organisations who are seeking to develop their own diversity agenda and bring about lasting racial equity within their organisations. We are also joined by Hannah Manyewu, an experienced leader in the social housing sector. She is currently Interim Director of Customer Services at Beyond Housing. And Hannah has led diversity and inclusion programmes at a number of high-profile housing associations, championing inclusive recruitment, staff development, mentoring and engagement. And finally, welcome to Amarjit Singh Basi, who over the course of his career has held senior leadership roles, such as Principal and CEO in the further and higher education sector, including Cornwall College, New College, Nottingham, Ealing, Hammersmith and West London College. He is currently an executive and founder member of the recently formed Black Further Education Leadership Group, which was set up in 2020 to address the challenges associated with systemic racism in further education. And part of their campaign has involved developing a 10-point plan outlining how senior leadership teams and boards can bring about real and sustainable change. So a quick word on our format this morning. Our panel discussion will take about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll look to spend 10 minutes at the end on questions. So if you have any questions that you want to put to our panel, please use the Q&A function on Teams. We will see them all. We won't be able to necessarily publish them all. And as we just have an hour this morning, we may not answer every question, but we will do our best. So to kick off our discussion, Hannah, if I can go to you first. For any organisations, leaders and individuals who are currently working to actively develop their diversity and inclusion strategy, what in your opinion are the key benefits that they can hope to gain from building a more inclusive culture within their organisation? Hannah.
I think for me it's really simple in that if people feel like they can be themselves, and probably this is a bit of an American phrase, but if they can bring their whole selves to work and feel they can be themselves, whatever characteristics they have, whether they have a particular faith or particular cultural background, the more that they can be themselves at work, the more they'll be able to be productive, they'll be able to be effective in what they're doing. They're more likely to feel engaged in the organisation and be able to collaborate with colleagues. So the more effective the organisation will be, the more successful it will be. Organisations with those sorts of cultures and with a really inclusive approach are more successful. There's loads of evidence about it. And increasingly, people are looking to work for organisations that have that culture. So it's not just about who's currently working with you, it's about who's going to want to work with you in the future. So attracting talent, retaining talent. And so organisation success will come with a more inclusive culture. And the other thing is, increasingly, whoever your customer is, so every sector has a different customer, whether it's business to business or whether you provide a customer service, increasingly customers want to know that their organisation is inclusive and diverse, and that the organisation that's providing any services to them reflects their characteristics and is as diverse as the world that we're all living in. So it sort of feels really obvious and quite simplistic, but for me they're the reasons. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Hannah. So Carmen, could I get your take on that in terms of those benefits that organisations can gain?
Okay, good morning, Claire. Huge benefits in terms of diversity and inclusion. There's a whole agenda now, a whole focus on diversity and inclusion, and a very much increased focus now around race and the race equality agenda. I think one of the huge benefits that organisations can gain is to position themselves in a clarity around their conviction, supporting the statements that they have made around diversity and inclusion since the unfortunate circumstances that happened last year. The benefits are huge. First of all, there are huge sections of the employee work base that suffer discrimination and demand equity. For organisations that are able to be positive and support both the internal workplace and the external environment around diversity and inclusion, the benefits are huge. First of all, you have better engaged people within the workforce. You're more attractive for people seeking to come to work within your business and to work with your business, i.e. your clients. And thirdly, and it's a bit of a cliche, it is the right thing to do if we're talking about equity. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Carmen. And Amarjit, what would you add to that in terms of those benefits?
Okay, thanks, Claire. The trouble with following two experts is that you have to then pinch at straws with regards to adding value. So I think what I'd like to say is that the moral case, the psychological case, and the business case, and I'm going to major on the business case, is just as relevant to the public sector as it is to the private sector. And I make no apologies in majoring on the business case, because, for example, if you look at institutions in further education, the student representation of Black and minority students is approaching a third, 30%, and yet senior leadership is 5%. And that's reflected, that underrepresentation is represented at all levels of the workforce, not just in colleges, but actually in the context of sector bodies, and also reflected when you analyse the data in different functions and roles. So the benefits are absolutely huge, but you need to contextualise what the challenges are.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. I think you answered that very well, despite what you said. I think you're just as much an expert. So, Carmen, we touched a little bit on this, but in that drive for inclusion, what role do you feel senior leadership, in particular of an organisation, really needs to play in terms of putting forward the case and driving the diversity agenda, in your opinion?
Okay, traditionally, diversity and inclusion has been left, if you may, to a few individuals or a few core groups within the organisation. I think what organisations are realising now is that without senior leadership, and this is from board level, your C-suite buy-in to diversity and inclusion, it's not going to be effective. You have to have the buy-in from the top of the organisation, with leadership working with the other functions within the organisation and different staff cohorts to really push the agenda as one that is authentic and one that is leadership driven. Without that, we're going to end up with what has traditionally been the race equality, diversity and inclusion agenda. So that sincere and robust attention to diversity and inclusion by senior leadership is absolutely imperative to be able to support diversity and inclusion across the organisation. I would add that diversity and inclusion is important in terms of the organisational benefit and how senior leadership can drive that, but they also have a duty in terms of their industry to be having these conversations cross-organisationally and on an industry level. Thanks.
Thank you, Carmen. And Amarjit, this is something we talked about one-on-one when we were discussing this whole session. So, you know, you've got some opinions around senior leadership, and obviously your group, you're focusing on, you know, supporting senior leadership on boards to really drive the agenda. So what, in your opinion, role do they need to play?
Even though I mentioned representation in my previous response, Claire, I think the primary focus, central focus, must be setting the culture. And that must be leadership driven, as Carmen identified. Alongside that, it is reviewing the evidence, identifying the data, avoiding a head in the sand perspective, not just in the context of the internal challenges, but also the external challenges. So to give you one example, it's a fairly easy discussion within conurbations and cities where you've got multicultural, you know, sort of representation. People can see the argument representation. Sometimes it's less easy when people are in less diverse scenarios, but they can't see, or no one has invited them to confront the facts with regards to current, future, global trends. For example, post-Brexit Britain will become increasingly diverse. 1 in 4 of young people between 16 to 24 at the moment are Black and minority ethnic. That will be 1 in 3 within the next couple of decades. But most critically, it's going to be more dispersed. So areas which are not diverse now will be diverse. And that is an important part of challenging senior teams to actually think about the parameters, not just in terms of the internal dimensions, but the external and the global dynamics that are working around them.
Thank you. And Hannah, particularly where perhaps at the moment a leadership team may be lacking diversity themselves, they're pretty homogenous, similar background, sex, gender, whatever. How can those leaders improve their own education and awareness around inclusivity? What have you seen that's worked maybe in the past, in your experience?
Yeah, I think this is a really obviously fundamental, and also quite clearly I have some characteristics that, you know, that mean that I've experienced that, you know, I have my own background and my own sort of what defines me, but quite clearly I'm not representative of all the people we're trying to include. So from my own experience as a leader, and I think what the difference, so after what happened with Black Lives Matter this summer, the difference in organisations and how they responded to that, and leaders and how they responded to that was about I think that how much learning people did. So I think as leaders, your responsibility is to understand, and I was thinking about this, first and foremost, understand the position in your own organisation. So actually, sort of similar to what Amarjit said, in terms of what is the profile within your organisation? Who are your colleagues? What is their profile? Really know that about your business. But most importantly, then from there, what are you going to do? And I think the biggest thing leaders can do is really challenge themselves, make themselves uncomfortable, really speak to people and mean it. Not just, it's not just one focus group so you can say that you've done it. It's about actually setting up opportunities for people to speak to you, to talk about their experience, to tell you how it feels in the organisation. Do they feel included? What are some of the barriers? What are the areas that people feel like, who work in your business, feel like need to be improved? So I do think it's very much about speaking to people and really listening. And then sort of separately to that, I think it's about creating kind of mentoring conversations as well. So perhaps they come out of those initial listening conversations, but spotting people that actually really want to progress or really want to be doing something slightly different, and creating opportunities for those people to keep speaking to you as a leader, so that you're learning from them, but also you're perhaps having good conversations with them. And then I think the other thing that I have done personally, and also have seen done well, and actually I've listened to a couple of TED Talks recently, and this is quite a common theme, is using your own network, whether that's kind of your personal life network or your professional network, but actually asking people who have experience. So during the Black Lives Matter, I spoke to black friends and colleagues, and really tried to sort of say to them, tell me honestly, how have you felt about certain, things that have happened in the past, or what's your experience been, and really kind of using your network to understand what the experience is. And I think from doing that learning and actually being really committed to it, that's what will be the difference for leaders who really kind of shift the culture in their businesses and really are committed to changing things.
Thank you, Hannah. Carmen, anything to add to that from your perspective?
Sorry, is that me or?
Yes, sorry, Carmen. Yeah.
Okay.
Anything you wanted to just add to that?
Yes, I think, and following on from what Hannah's just said, I think sometimes there's a difficulty in actually saying building your awareness, because it is actually getting leadership to want to build their awareness. If they're not aware that they are not aware of lived experience, then that in itself is going to pose a problem. So what I would say is that for leadership, one of the best things that they can do is understand or take as written that they do not know the lived experiences of people, whether they are their friends or colleagues, and undertake leadership training around diversity and inclusion that involves lived experience, where that can be done in a controlled way, where people with lived experiences, and it helps also if they're not from their organization, so that they can develop knowledge and understanding that is aligned to what they want to do organizationally. If I speak to, for example, I have a friend who is disabled, I will never know what it is to live in his life, but by speaking with him, I can gain an understanding of the commonalities between discrimination, the commonalities that surround the D&I agenda from lived experience. I think the danger of leaving it to leadership, just say, no, you're homogeneous, go and improve your understanding and your knowledge and your awareness, is that many people go to YouTube, they might read a couple of books and think, okay, I know it, I'm leadership, and this is what we're going to do. That has been proven many, many times not to work, because you're not exactly delivering the value that your marginalized employees and the external environment actually seeks.
Thank you, Carmen. Amarjit, you know, as we're discussing it, it's clearly important, obviously, that diversity and inclusion is an integral and meaningful part of an organisation's culture and future growth strategy. So as we're talking around leaders, what resources, in your experience, do leaders need to allocate in order to achieve that growth and that focus around delivering real change within diversity and inclusion?
It's a great question, Claire, and the first one I think feeds off the point that Hannah and Carmen made. So first of all, the level of ownership and investment and commitment on the part of leaders is a resource in its own time, because they have to prioritize the focus on this. It's not a simple project, it's not a short meeting, it's not something that you would construe as a task. This requires heavy lifting. It requires staff development and time across all levels of the organisation. It needs to involve everyone, and that's really, really important. And there needs to be investment in change management. And again, that's not an easy fix. It needs to be strategic, it needs to be structured, it needs to hone in to the priorities by the collection and engagement with data. And I think, as Carmen identified, it's not just about the quantitative, it's the qualitative, it's the lived experiences, it's the perspectives. And it also means setting up a climate and investing in an organisation that's comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, as Hannah identified. And that's a really important investment in creating a safe environment across the organisations. It does require a framework, and that framework will be unique to the organisation. And because you mentioned our 10-point plan, as part of our support for the further education sector, we've developed a 10-point plan that focuses on 4 themes, which are curriculum, because the students are the centre of our universe. It's about climate, it's about culture, and finally it's about communication. So it does require a structured perspective that requires a different lens as well. So Carmen's point about bringing in expertise, not only to challenge, but actually to hold organisations' hands through a long-term process, I would suggest are important resources as we move the agenda forward.
Great, thank you, Amarjit. So I'm going to move on from that leadership point now, and just you know, to cover off the fact that our HR recruitment team at Morgan Hunt has seen a big increase in the number of organisations looking to appoint heads of diversity and inclusion over the past few months in particular. So clearly there's a change happening, and that is good. And these are mostly new positions to a lot of these organisations, so where they didn't exist in the past. I suppose my question really is, what harm could arise if such roles were seen as token positions or just performative by staff? A little bit of window dressing to address the areas. So Carmen, what harm could you see coming from that if that were the case to organisations and to their staff?
Actually doing that would destroy any credibility that the organisation has around diversity and inclusion. I agree with you, there has been an explosion of diversity and inclusion officers, managers, heads of diversity, etc., etc. I don't know whether much of this has been on the back of the statements made last May, June time, around the death of George Floyd. I don't know how much of this is a knee-jerk reaction and hasn't been fully thought out. If you don't have the authentic commitment to actually develop your diversity and inclusion strategy and believe that by having a head of diversity, diversity manager, etc., you will tick the box and be seen as an inclusive organization. Organizational leadership is making a grave mistake. I also, from time to time, have a little look on job descriptions for these heads of diversities. I wonder if they're actually asking for the right things. Are these copy and paste job descriptions for somewhere else? Because sometimes what they're asking for is not going to fulfill their objectives. The second point around that is a lot of, diversity and inclusion experts, consultants, practitioners have come. I don't know where they've been. I've been around for 27 years now, and all of a sudden there are thousands of people doing this. But having a look on LinkedIn profiles, and just because I know a lot of people in this industry, this is the only industry I've ever worked in, I look at people's LinkedIn profiles and I see something like HR manager or HR generalist, and now I see that you're a diversity and inclusion practitioner. Please call and I will discuss with you what diversity and inclusion practitioner is. So there are a lot of people out there, a lot of charlatans out there, and I'm a little bit concerned about an organization that doesn't, or is in the very beginning of their journey around authentic diversity and inclusion. Do they themselves know what they want, and more importantly, what they want when they want it, and how they should utilize it? I mean, it's like, this is like a gold rush now. There's a lot of it happening in the industry. And my concern is a lot of it will do more damage than not. My last point around this is, when you do engage a head of diversity and inclusion manager, what authority are you giving to that role? Does that person, as has happened in the past, answer to the head of HR or the learning and development manager? Or does that person have a seat at the leadership table? Do they work with your board? Because if we don't have a continuous interaction between what's happening in the business and the board and leadership, then we're actually not doing anything. It is indeed performative. So although the roles are good, I would urge organizations to actually know what you are looking for in this role and who you are hiring, and to do your due diligence in terms of your new head of diversity and inclusion, who actually has never worked in a role that has been 100% focused on diversity and inclusion. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Carmen. So Hannah, on that point then, what advice would you give to a diversity and inclusion professional who may be considering taking on such a newly created role? So it's new to the organisation, but really focusing on how to help them gauge, what Carmen discussed, that real authentic commitment from leadership in an organisation. What advice would you give somebody like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting sort of development, isn't it? And I think it's fair to say, just to add to what Carmen said as well, I completely understand those and agree with those kind of the potential sort of risks and concerns. But also overall, I do see it as a real positive. I think it's a sign of a commitment to something that, if it hasn't been in your organisation before, it's a great sign that people are starting to create that focus. But I absolutely agree with Carmen. It's about getting that right and not seeing that person is the person who should who should be dealing with it, and very much positioning that person and then them positioning themselves as they join in an enabling role. So their job is not to do, their job is to get other people mobilised, it's to, you know, to build that momentum, it's to make the leaders, you know, it's a challenge to make the leaders accountable. So in terms of the question of sort of what advice to somebody going into one of those new roles, I think, and again, this touches on what Carmen already said, I think the starting point for me would be to sort of, for them to understand what leadership commitment there is. So have you got a board sponsor? Who is it? Are they the right person? Have you got, you know, how does that sponsorship work? Is there an exec level sponsorship? Again, are they right? And then I think really understanding what approach is in place already. So speaking to everybody at every level, you know, speaking to, if you've got a staff diversity group in place, who's on it? What do they feel like it's really working? Is it just something that gets together once a month so that we can say we've got one, or is it actually making an impact? So really sort of understanding what's in place already, how well people feel like it's working, and identifying with the organisation where they feel the gaps are. So the role of that person is to bring in the, you know, again, touching on what Carmen said, to bring in the recommendations and to bring in the expertise around what could be in place, but very much for the business to be delivering it and for that commitment to come from the business. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think is really important, and I know different sectors do this differently. So I come from the social housing sector that's really collaborative. It's essentially public sector. We work really close with other colleagues on everything. If you're looking at a new policy, you speak to other people in the same role that you as other organisations, and you share what you do. I know not all sectors are that open and collaborative, but where possible, speaking to other people in similar roles, speaking to partner organisations, specialist organisations, you know, what exists that your organisation could tap into. So within social housing, there's quite a few. There's an LGBT group that's set up specifically for housing. There's an organisation called House Proud, which is specifically sponsoring people who work in housing or getting people together to focus and share their experiences and to build up the profile and sort of inclusion approach. So really understanding that by speaking to people in similar roles. And then I think your job as that lead is to set the programme for the organisation, but being really clear about what influence and authority you have, like Carmen mentioned, to really make things happen. So yeah, I think it's absolutely about being clear and positioning yourself, if it's not how you're positioned through your role profile, as an enabler, and all of your success measures are very much about what other people deliver.
Thank you, Hannah. Amarjit, would you like to add something on that?
Yeah, people have probably heard of the loneliness of the long distance runner. Beware of the loneliness of a director for EDI. And whilst it might be well-meaning, it can't be done in isolation, as Carmen and Hannah have identified. But my career has involved being a cross-college manager. You know, it's got the God-given set, you know, task of leading change in the organisation. So the success ingredients for that role, from my perspective, is secure agency, mainstream strategy, spotlight outstanding practice wherever it exists, secure resources to affect change, and most importantly, you get authority from the highest levels of the organisation.
Thank you. That makes sense. And that kind of led on to another question I had. So we've kind of already covered it really in terms of what staff, but most importantly, senior leadership can do to kind of drive that change with a head of diversity and inclusion. So I'll go on to another area. And Carmen, as a diversity and inclusion expert in the field, how do you feel diversity and inclusion training programs can add value across an organisation? You know, specifically maybe for certain groups, be that HR or senior leadership and board training, or across the organisation for all staff. What's your opinion on that, Carmen?
Okay, I think first and foremost, leadership training around diversity and inclusion is imperative. Also, board training. What this actually does is it conceptualizes diversity and inclusion as an agenda for that specific business. Okay, so once the board and leadership are aware of diversity and inclusion, how they want it to impact the business in the future, why it is necessary to do this, taking on board all the external factors and factors such as their recruitment, business growth, supported employees, etc., 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 can then look at specific training for other functions within the business. For example, HR. What do they need to be doing? Learning and development. How does diversity and inclusion impact their roles? Now, generic training is useful. However, if you are having training, if you're receiving training that is generic and you walk away from that and say, oh, that was very thought-provoking, excellent, I really learned something about that, and you go back to your desk and you don't know what to do within your role, the training has not been as effective as it could have been. This is about getting the training that supports your organization to deliver on the agenda. Now, that is not necessarily very interesting and, oh, that was wonderful and thought-provoking. That is something that is going to give your business, your organization agency to, one, be able to deliver on a result, number two, which informs and supports overall organizational and business strategy, and number three, equips your employees at all different levels with the skills that they need to deliver. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Carmen. Amarjit, would you like to add something to that?
Building on Carmen's really helpful response, I reiterate strategic purpose and focus. It needs to be contextualized. It can't be a one-off, and it needs to involve everybody. And just to bring sort of a little bit of controversy into it, just before Christmas, there was some furore about the value of unconscious bias training, including government departments withdrawing, some of that. I think that illustrates the way that has to be introduced, has to be linked into your core purpose, your values, and very much be contextualized in order to identify the priorities for your people, for your customers, for your business.
Yes.
As you go forward. So it's not a problem with the training, as some of the political sort of observations are. It's actually about how you develop that training and embed and instill it so that it works for you and your organization.
Thank you. So Hannah, I mean, you've been involved over the course of your career in getting involved in internal programs that drive inclusion in an organization. So what might those internal programs or initiatives look like, and how can those add value in your opinion?
Yeah, I think in terms of internal programs, it's very much about designing what's right for your organisation. So I think it's pretty much consistent with everything we've talked about. If you take something off the shelf, you might be able to tick the box and say that you've done it, but is it the right fit for your organisation, where you currently are on a journey, your culture? So I think it's about designing what's right for your organisation, and how you design it is based on what you've learned. So what's the data telling you? But also from those conversations with staff and colleagues and at different levels in your board, where have you landed? So what are the priorities? You know, I'm thinking about, from organisations I've worked in, you know, learning where is the perception of the barriers to being more diverse and more inclusive? Is it actually at entry? So is it actually more where you need to put more of your effort and your focus in your programme on your recruitment processes? Or actually is it more about then, once people are in the business, the barrier is to going from middle management to a senior management position, and is that where the focus should be? So actually the programme for that organisation perhaps should use their investment and their funding and their focus more on a kind of a programme, you know, a management training that's more about moving from a manager to a leader. Or so I think you should design it based on your organisation and where you are. And I think that in terms of one of the other things that I haven't said yet, but feels like it's really important to flag, the success of anything in terms of, yes, it's absolutely about leadership, sponsorship, making sure that there's the sort of focus and priority on this. But the other thing that I think makes it successful or not is engaging really passionate people who really care about things. So getting kind of champions engaged in whatever it is that your organisation does. So in terms of that programme, and again, just in terms of really practical experience, where things have worked really well, the programme is a few different things. It's a communication and awareness kind of campaign. So like really practical, getting people to talk about their lived experiences, like Carmen's mentioned. It's a programme of formal training, you know, unconscious bias training or some diversity awareness training. And then alongside that, you might have some programmes for kind of people development. So it might be a mixture of things. But the success of those different things are about how it's led and how it's delivered and monitored. So actually impact monitoring is huge. So the so what factor of, you've said all these things, you've set all these targets, what's happening with it, what impact has it had? And then also who's helping you along the way. And the best way to deliver something like this and make it actually get embedded in the culture is to identify those people who are passionate and going to help drive it forward. So it's not just about people at the right seniority, it's people with enough focus and drive to make it and it's like if you're trying to look for change agents, but basically making sure you've got people who are really passionate and committed that are helping you take that forward or helping the organisation.
Thank you, Hannah. So, Amarjit, I thought I'd come to you with regard to this because I know it's one of the key areas of focus, and in fact, we're talking to you about it with the Black Further Education Leadership Group. So, with regard to genuinely inclusive recruitment, what key tips would you give an organisation when they are looking to attract diverse talent?
A few things, Claire, and we're working with search companies drawn from across the sector to develop an anti-racism protocol. So the conversation's really live. So the first one is, do organisations truly know what their organisation looks like to candidates and prospective candidates, external as well as internal? The second one is there proactive reach out to people? Again, in the context of how you advertise, but also how you communicate and how you convey the fact that these roles and posts are for people like you. I have a phrase of hand on the shoulder inside the organisation. My first 3 promotions were not as a result of a structured career plan on my part. They were a hand on the shoulder from people who were either advocates or line managers or gatekeepers.
Yes.
Through the process. You know, so it's not just the professionals involved through the structured part, it's those informal collisions that people have internally as well as externally. And then there's the technical elements of represented panels, two-way process, but it doesn't just stop at appointment. It's also about often neglected area, which is onboarding, because once you've got someone appointed, you know, the work really starts there. But it's really interesting. People are then appointed on the context of their merits through the process, but then they're expected to be compliant to the structures, the behaviors, the values, and so on. How many organizations appointed people ask the question, how do we need to change in order to optimize your potential and contribution?
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm just looking at the time, so I'm keen to leave about 10 minutes at the end, so I'll probably just cover a few more. There's a few more topics I would like to cover. One of those is, alongside the external recruitment, it's clearly just as important that organisations ensure that they're developing their own internal diverse talent pipelines, and that can often be one of the biggest blockers. So, Carmen, if I could go to you first and perhaps get some input from Hannah afterwards, but what tips would you give an organisation in terms of developing their own internal pipeline of talent?
Right. Okay. Quickly, if you look at organizations, they're very, very much homogeneous. There is a split that can be clearly seen within most organizations. Diversity is usually at the lower tiers of structure within organizations. I think everybody, I don't think there are many people that would disagree with that. How then do you change your organization? Tips would be, if, for example, an HR manager, a head of diversity and inclusion is going on leave, who do they allow to deputize for them? It is usually someone from the same background. How about opening up and giving those opportunities to diverse groups of people? And the reason why these things are so important is that when we go for a role, say, for example, I want to go for a manager, an HR manager position. I've been working in the organization for 5, 10 years, 8 years. And they say, well, what experience? Well, I know what to do. I don't actually have the experience because every time that opportunity comes up, Jane gets it or Karen gets it. It is never offered to me. And we need to look at ourselves and ask the hard questions and answer them truthfully. Why is that? Why is it that the same people get the same opportunities? So it's about looking at organizational framework, looking at systems and ensuring that there are changes in terms of systems and activities that are actually holding people back within the organization.
Thank you, Carmen. And Amarjit, I thought I'd come to you around we talked around data monitoring and diversity data monitoring. So most organizations engage in diversity data monitoring when they're looking to attract talent. But we know that sometimes that can put people off because they're concerned, perhaps sometimes providing that data in itself will lead to bias. So how would you advise organizations to positively encourage potential recruits to provide this anonymous data? Because we know it's helpful and it, both when attracting, but also when, monitoring your current staff. So how would you position that in a positive way?
A few things, Claire. I think in seeking to secure that data, show that you mean what you say. Use examples of how that data has been used positively previously, case studies, testimonials, evidence of progress. Those are the things that I would major on. Thanks, Claire.
That makes sense. And then Hannah, just as a kind of I suppose a conclusion to our group discussion, and I'll pick up some questions from the Q&A channel because they're piling up and I'd like to cover some. And as you know, we're here in January 2021. It's going to be a challenging year again, as we all know, with COVID and everything that's coming our way. But what are your thoughts and hopes in terms of the progress of the overall diversity agenda over the next 12 months? What progress would you like to see, I guess, you know? It's a big question, I know.
Yeah, I think I'm conscious I'm not as specific or concise when I'm answering as some girl goes. I think it's a range of things for me. I think we are on a journey, and that's not meant to sound like a cop-out. I think we need to be realistic about what's possible and how long things will take. So I don't mean that in an unambitious way, but I mean in the next year, I think it's more of what we're already seeing. So certainly again within my sector, seeing more and more leadership, chief exec posts filled by people with diverse characteristics. So just seeing more of that happening. There's a really visible commitment, again, within my sector, but also more widely. I read an article this morning that Sky has just published some figures about it's going to make sure that it's basically looked at its profile of customers in the areas it works, and it said that it wants a commitment of 25% diverse employees within I think it's a 3-year time period. And that's for me, that's really where we need to keep moving, is increasing sort of really public visible commitment from organisations to this, real sort of accountability. So people really saying, we really mean it. We're not just trying to it's not a trend. We really mean it. We're going to focus on this. And then seeing the evidence, so what people are delivering and what impact that's having. And I think the other thing is about, going back to the last question, for me, it's about the visibility and accountability. So, we've seen the gender pay gap reporting, and there's a move towards increasingly being really accountable for who is working in your business, how equal is it. So for me, it's more of the same and more of a continuous move towards organisations doing more of that stuff. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you, Hannah. So I wanted to pick up some of our questions from our audience. So I've got one here, and this is somebody working as a junior officer and saying that it can be really challenging having conversations with senior staff. In their organisation, there's a clear lack of diversity in the senior management team and trustees. These are people who get say on things that happen in the organisation. So how can somebody in a junior position hold them accountable? And how can they address the issue with them? Who would like to pick that one up?
I think one of the things that will be helpful is, if you are in that situation, you're a junior member of staff, is to try and find somebody who has a higher position than yourself, who you can use as an ally, maybe a few of them, to push that message further up the organisation. Perhaps starting a group, a network within the organisation to develop confidence within the organisation, and then push that up towards using your allies to get the attention of the leadership group. It's a very difficult situation, is that one?
Yeah. Hannah, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think that I've got two things to add to what Carmen said, really. The first one is, I would just really encourage the person to just take a step back and think, is there a real limitation with your contact, or is it more your own perception? So I know for myself, when I first started out, the idea of someone at that kind of chief exec and executive level feels so far away, and you feel like, oh God, I can't possibly bother with them something. But actually, could you try, unless you've tried this and it hasn't worked, but could actually you try saying, would it be possible to put in, could I have a chat with you for 5 minutes, just to sort of talk to you about my feelings, and I would suggest actually just think really hard if that's a limitation that you've assumed and put in place yourself rather than something that's real. But I also know that in many cases it doesn't feel very accessible. So I think what Carmen said is right as well. But the other thing you could do is, I don't know if you have any any staff satisfaction surveys that happen regularly, or any kind of feedback opportunity with your line manager. And perhaps if you feel like you could use those. Definitely organisations and leadership teams do or should focus hard on what comes through on staff surveys. So if you could use that as another mechanism, or through your one-to-one with your own line manager, that's another option as well.
Thank you. Amarjit?
I think it's enabling in a safe environment, even if it means working, you know, outside the structure. The point about allies, champions, and so on, whatever. Where it's really, really difficult is when clearly there's a hostile environment. And I think the key message is that, given where we are in 2021, and given, you know, clearly the moral case, the psychological investment, and so on, it's not tenable for organisations at the very top to be party to hostile environments. So if that person feels that way, and that seems to be prevalent, there has to be, you know, a really, really important discourse, acknowledgement. But that requires emotional intelligence on the part of the leadership. And maybe the only way to engage that is to secure some external support.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That makes sense. This seems like an important one, as we've touched on it. Another question: how do you balance hearing from the employees who have the lived experience without them feeling that they are being asked to be the solution providers? So, Hannah, would you like to give an opinion on that?
Yeah, I think that's such a great sort of question or observation, and I should have covered this. So again, there's been a huge amount of noise about this around the Black Lives Matter, in that it is not the responsibility. It's my responsibility to learn and understand. It's not the responsibility of the person who's experienced, you know, who's experienced being a minority or being, you know, excluded in some way. The burden is with me to try and understand it, not for them to have to explain it. So I think that's a really good question, and I think but I suppose it's seeing it slightly differently. It's helping people who want to understand. So, you know, like I used the example earlier that I reached out to my network professionally and informally last June and kind of said, you know, I'm asking you how you feel. I'm not sort of making you educate me. I just want to understand how you feel. And they were really open and I learned so much, and you know, it was really challenging. So in the same way, I think if your organisation is really committed to trying to be more inclusive and open, then can you help your organisation to do that by explaining what your experience is and how you feel in that organisation and what your lived experience is? Then it doesn't feel like it's an unreasonable contribution for you to make, in the same way that I would make if the organisation asked me what could we do to improve technology. I would contribute really actively in that. So I suppose it's kind of balancing those two things, isn't it? Not putting a burden onto people, but actually helping the organisation to get where it needs to.
Thank you, Hannah. Carmen, you have something to add there?
Yeah, just following on from what Hannah said, I think it goes back to that leadership commitment and authenticity around the D&I agenda. If an organisation is genuinely committed to moving forward with D&I, then and that is communicated to staff, then I don't see that a diversity network would not want to support the development of that agenda. But clearly, it's what happened post the death of George Floyd was, you know, everybody wanted a staff diversity network. Black staff, speak to me. What does this mean? We have to consider that you are asking people who have suffered years, decades, a lifetime of microaggression to suddenly have an outpouring of, oh, this is what it feels like. So you have to kind of manage that where there is a safe environment for staff to share information with the organization to help to develop the organization, but that has to be in a very carefully managed way.
Thank you, Carmen. Amarjit, do you want to finish off on that one?
Yeah, just a couple of examples really over very recent times involving leaders, and one went down the line that Carmen alluded to, laid themselves very vulnerable to a group of ethnic minority staff and asked them to inform and shape the priorities for the organisation, and committed resources to that. Another one where they tried to do the same conversation, but then came and spoke to us as a group and said that what I learned from the process is my staff are very forgiving. They're very nice. And do I want to upset the status quo? Because they're quite grateful that I'm here as their leader. And it's totally different parallel tracks. One had set a massive expectation, another one almost a patronizing relationship. So it's really critical, you know, how those dynamics work out.